Dr. Perry is an assistant professor in the Department of Entomology at The Ohio State University and is based at the Wooster campus. Her research aims to understand how disturbances influence the structure and function of insect communities in natural and urban forests. Natural disturbances such as fire and wind are integral components of forest ecosystems, but human-induced disturbances such as exotic species, habitat degradation, and climate change impact forest health and management. Kayla's previous research has focused on disturbances caused by emerald ash borer, windstorms, salvage logging, and urbanization. She has extensive experience working with ground and soil-dwelling insect communities and is a ground beetle expert. Her teaching interests include insect ecology, invasion ecology, forest entomology, and ecological modeling. Kayla received her Ph.D. in entomology from The Ohio State University in December 2016. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? With my mic, am I loud enough? Yes, good, okay, great. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about fireflies. I love beetles. It's my favorite group, and so this is really exciting to be able to give this presentation today. So of course, the focus is fireflies, but I wanted to start out a little bit broader and talk about insect decline. And so then we can position our firefly story within this broader context, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. And so there's been a lot of discussion recently about declines in insect populations. And you may have heard insect apocalypse thrown out to describe this pattern. And indeed, there have been reported declines in insects, their abundance, their richness, and their biomass in certain situations. And so a really great example of this within the US here is the rusty patch bumblebee. And so the rusty patch shown here, Bombus affinis, it is listed as federally endangered. And you can see here on this map on the left side, this is its historic range within the eastern and Midwestern United States. And on the right is its current range. So you can see just a fraction of what it once was. And it used to be found widely throughout Ohio, but now we have not found a population since, I believe, around 2014. And so this is just one example of an insect species that was once in Ohio and now is declining, and its range has greatly contracted. However, there are many examples of this. So here is a classic study that came out around the time that insect decline was becoming a buzz. And so this is a study from a nature reserve in Germany where they set out malaise traps, which is pictured here. It's essentially a tent-shaped trap. Insects fly in it and they get caught in a little collection tube that's up at the top here. And so these folks in Germany set out these malaise traps from 1989 to 2016, and they looked at the biomass of insects that were collected in these traps. And so here is a figure showing the data that they found. So we're looking at a measure of biomass over time, and each one of these bars is the biomass that they observed among different traps each year. And so you can see from year to year, there's a lot of variability in the biomass that they found, but overall there's a general decline over time. And so some of the work that I've done looking at insect decline has been in Ohio, looking at native lady beetle populations. So of course, lady beetles are the state insect of Ohio, and there are many species that are declining within the state. And so I wanted to understand why native lady beetles are declining. This was part of my postdoc work. And to do this, I use museum specimens, which are a really great resource if you want to understand trends in insect populations over time. And here is a figure from that work where I'm looking at proportions of collections. So a proportion of insects, of lady beetles particularly, we looked at a group of different species within the collection over time. And so all these light bars here represent native species like convergent lady beetle, two-spotted lady beetle, and nine-spotted lady beetle. And then over time, we can actually see the increase in exotic lady beetle species come into the collection. That's shown in these dark bars here. So that's like the multicolored Asian lady beetle. And so we were able to track this shift in lady beetle populations over time using museum specimens and identify exotic species as a driver of native lady beetle decline. However, there's something else that was really important that came out of this work. And we can see declines in native species if we look at them as a whole, but if we look at the responses of each individual species, we found that the declines in captures and what they were responding to was very species specific. And so an example of that here is the twice-stabbed lady beetle. And this species specializes on scale insects, and so it primarily feeds in trees on scale insects. And so this species responded very positively to the amount of forest within the landscape surrounding where it was collected. And interestingly, in Ohio, we're actually increasing in forest cover over time. Here's some landscape data from the 1930s up to 2016. And Ohio, very uniquely, is actually growing in forested land cover over time. And so we actually saw an increase in the twice-stabbed lady beetle over time in response to this increase in forest cover. So species are responding to very particular things within the environment based on their own ecology and what they need to survive. And so the insect decline conversation gets a little complicated. I shared some data with you where we do see insect species declining, but how broad is this insect apocalypse? Are all insect populations declining? And well, no, they're not. And so some studies have actually documented stable or increasing populations of insects as well. And so this figure here is from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And we're looking at the percentage of insect species in different insect orders. So first we have Coleoptera, which are beetles. We have Hymenoptera, which are ants, bees, and wasps. Lepidoptera, which are butterflies and moths. Odonata, which are dragonflies and damselflies. And then Orthoptera, which are grasshoppers and crickets. And so within these bars here, you can see red as the percentage of species in these orders that are decreasing. Green are those that are increasing, and gray represents those species that are stable. And so yes, there are a lot of species that we have detected to be declining. However, there are some shown in green that are increasing, and there are also a large percentage of species that have stable populations based on the data that we currently have. And so one great example of this is a study that was done in Great Britain looking at moth species. And they sampled moths over 40 years. And they didn't just look at total abundance of moths overall, they identified those to species, and they tracked species over time. And so they found that about 260 species declined, 160 species increased, and around 250 species remained unchanged or were stable. And so really what this is telling us is this story about the insect apocalypse, insects declining, is actually quite complicated. And we need to take a look at the species that we're talking about and their ecology and biology in order to understand which ones are declining and why. And this can create some challenges for insect ecologists like me in order to detect insect populations and whether or not they're declining. And so some things that you might want to think about when you're reading about studies in the literature or in popular media and understanding the findings that these studies are reporting. Well, how long was that study? Was it short versus long? That's going to tell you a lot about how confident they are in those insect population results. There's also a lot of geographic and habitat biases, which are represented here in this figure. We have some areas that are very well sampled for insects, such as the United States and Europe, and other areas such as Africa and South America where we have less data. There are also taxonomic biases. So a lot of people like to study bees, for example, or moths, where there are other insect taxa where we just really don't know enough about them to say whether or not they're declining. And then, of course, as I just mentioned, taxonomic resolution is really important if you want to understand why a species is declining. Are you looking at the species, or are you looking more broadly at a collection of species? All of these different things are going to contribute to whether or not you can understand what insect populations are doing and also how to help them and develop management and conservation strategies. So we do have some evidence that insects, yes, indeed, are declining. And so what are the causes, and maybe what can we do to help? And the short story is we're the cause. We're doing a lot of things to the environment that are affecting insects in addition to other wildlife. And so researchers have begun to think about this as death by 1,000 cuts. And so a variety of different stressors, many of them, like I said, due to humans, are sort of synergistically impacting insect populations globally. And so this includes things like insecticides, exotic species, which are only increasing, introductions are only increasing over time due to globalization. We've got urbanization and other forms of land use change, pollution. We also have global warming and the impacts that global warming is having on weather. So increasing storm intensity, affecting drought, and affecting fire. And so many of these disturbances that are listed here can be considered chronic disturbances that aren't necessarily pulses. They're there and they're gone. They're being maintained in the environment. And then, of course, why do we care? Hopefully, you all know why we care because you're here tonight at 7 listening to a talk about fireflies. But just in case you want some more information about this, insects are incredibly abundant and they're incredibly diverse. And so here this figure is showing described species on Earth and also estimated species on Earth. And so you can see insects here in red make up about 50% of the described species. So those are species that we've currently collected, cataloged, and named. And they still, when we estimate how many species there could be out there that are still uncatalogued or undescribed, they still make up about half. And so insects are incredibly important in our environment. They have really important ecosystem services that we rely on. They're a dominant life form on Earth. And so a few ecosystem services, of course, that I wanted to highlight: pollination. Global food production depends on insect pollination. Decomposition, which is something I work on in my research, is incredibly important, and it's mostly insect driven. Decomposition of plant litter, of dung, of animal carcasses start with insects. And insects are also very important in pest control. And we really could not support food webs without insects. They're really important food for other invertebrates, but also for birds, for small mammals, for amphibians and reptiles. So there are a lot of reasons to care about insects and to care about the health of their populations. Okay. So the topic today, of course, is fireflies. And so I wanted to start and talk a little bit about insect decline. And now we're going to talk about a specific example of an insect group that may or may not be declining. And I'll give you some information about that and think about sort of what the causes are and then what we can do to help support firefly populations within our landscapes. And so as I was making this talk, I stumbled upon this figure: fireflies, lightning bugs. Which one is it? So both of these, of course, are common names for fireflies. They're both commonly used and commonly accepted, but they don't really portray accurately what fireflies are, because fireflies are, in fact, beetles, which is my favorite group of insects of all time. Fireflies, they're in the order Coleoptera, in family Lampyridae. That makes them beetles. So worldwide, we have over 2,200 described species, although there are many estimated undescribed species still out there. Fireflies still need a lot of research done within this group. In North America, there are about 170. Here I've got a picture of an adult and of a larval firefly. And then, of course, what we know and love about fireflies is their bioluminescence, right? They light up, they flash. Bioluminescence is used for a variety of different functions within fireflies. So it's used for communication, particularly courtship communication between males and females. It's also used in defense. So the flashing can be used as warning coloration to deter predators. And there's also functions with mimicry. And there's some really interesting deceptive behaviors in fireflies, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit here. But generally, this light that fireflies produce is essentially a chemical reaction that's occurring within the firefly, essentially just a chemical compound and an enzyme. And so their ability to control the flashing in such quick succession is a really interesting and unbelievable thing that they can do. Okay. And so much of the research that has been done on fireflies has really focused on bioluminescence. So how it's done in the firefly, they worked out this chemical reaction. They've looked at sort of the behaviors, what they mean, but we're really lacking in information on firefly, like basic biology, populations, and ecology. But I'm going to share a little bit about what we do know about fireflies. And so I'm going to start with adults. And so the adult stage of fireflies and the larval stage of fireflies, they have very different ecologies. And so I want to talk about each one because how we're going to sort of protect each one and the things that we're going to do or to support these populations are actually quite different. So adult fireflies can be both nocturnal and diurnal. In fact, some adult fireflies do not produce light. There's only a subset of them that do. They are found in diverse habitats. So this can be woodlands, these can be deserts, coastal salt marshes, bogs. But generally the adults are very short-lived. The adults are only around for 3 to 4 weeks. And most of them, as far as we know, do not feed. So there is some evidence that adults will nectar on plants. So there's some observations on milkweed. And then there are some situations where females will prey on other fireflies. But aside from these few exceptions, we don't have a lot of data on adult feeding, and they're generally considered to not feed throughout their life period, the adult life period. And their main goal is to really locate mates and to reproduce. Like that is what the adults do. And that is the whole point essentially of the adult bioluminescence that I'm going to talk about here in a little bit. And so adults are generally 5 to 20 millimeters. So they range quite a bit in size depending upon what species you have. And I wanted to share just some characters to help you identify them. And so they generally have a large pronotum, which is this structure here. And when you're looking down from them from above, they essentially cover, the pronotum covers the firefly head. They have these long, thin antennae. They have very large eyes. These are used for detecting the flashes of the opposite sex. And then they may or may not have a light organ. So here's an example of a light organ on a firefly. But as I mentioned, not all adult fireflies actually produce light. And so there are a variety of different courtship strategies that fireflies have evolved these very complex behaviors for attracting and locating mates, right? That is the job of the adults. So there are 4 different strategies that I'm going to briefly talk about here, but 3 of them we can find in fireflies in Ohio. Okay, so I just want to touch on each one of these so you get an appreciation for their behavior, their ecology, and then also this is going to tie into the stressors that are impacting fireflies later in the talk. And so the first courtship strategy are dark species. And essentially, these are species that do not produce bioluminescent light, and they mostly rely on finding mates through chemical communication. So they use pheromones. And they're active during the day. So they're active during the day, they don't need light, instead they're using chemicals to locate one another. And so because they're doing this, they actually have these really elaborate, the males in particular have these really elaborate antennae that allow them to pick up the pheromones of the female. And so here, this gray figure on the right, we've got the female on the bottom, we've got the male on the top. And so the female essentially perches on a piece of vegetation. She releases the pheromone into the air. It blows around. The male detects it with its very elaborate antennae, and then he can follow that pheromone to find the female for courtship to begin. The other 3 strategies all have some form of bioluminescence. So it is just a subset of firefly species that don't produce light. The majority of them do. So this next firefly courtship strategy I want to talk about were glowworm species. And so these species actually use a combination of bioluminescent communication and pheromones or chemical communication. And they're primarily active at night or at dusk. And they have this very interesting component to them where the females are flightless and they actually look like larvae. And so here is an example of the pink firefly. And so this is an adult female here, even though it looks like a larvae. And so again, we have our female here on the bottom. She's flightless and she is perching on a piece of vegetation. Oftentimes they can also be just at the soil surface, and she produces light, essentially a glow that holds steady. She doesn't flash, she just constantly glows. And then the male will use either just look for the light or can track those pheromones to find her, and then courtship will begin from there. And so flightless females in particular are very poor dispersers, right? If they can't fly, that means they're dispersing by crawling. And so this makes glowworm species particularly susceptible to different stressors. There's also flashing species. And so these are the ones that we think of when we think of fireflies. And so these species only use bioluminescent communication. They can be active at dusk or at night. And both the male and the female are capable of flight, and they fly around and they can both produce light. And so even though the female can fly, she often will perch on vegetation and wait for male signals. And so the male typically flies around and initiates the flash. And so each species has their own particular flash that they produce, and often they're different colors as well. The male will produce its specific flash, and then the female will identify that and will in return response and flash back. There are also some instances within this group, this courtship strategies group, where the flying males will synchronize. And so this is an example species, Photinus carolinus. So this is the species that's in the Great Smoky Mountains that often synchronizes the flashing of the males. Okay, and then the last courtship strategy are stationary synchronous species. And so these are not found within North America. They're primarily in different Asian countries, but they're really popular tourist attractions for seeing these synchronous fireflies. And so again, they only communicate via bioluminescent communication, active at night. Both males and females can produce light. And here the interaction is slightly different than what we've seen. And so it is the males that will group together. It's often called a lek. Within a tree, like an example would be in this picture. So the males essentially perch on the vegetation and they initiate the flashing, and the females will fly to them, which is opposite of the flashing species that we have here. But they do produce species-specific flight patterns, and they require that bioluminescent communication in order to reproduce successfully. So in addition to using bioluminescent communication to attract mates, there is this really interesting behavior where females within the genus Photurus will utilize bioluminescent communication and their specialist predators on other fireflies. So not fireflies of their own species, but of other species. And essentially, these females will wait around and they'll wait for another species that produces a flash pattern, and they will mimic the flash pattern of the female, like of that other species. And so the male will come in thinking that he has found, a mate, and in fact, no, he is now dinner. And so that is what you're seeing here. And so these female Photurus species, they can mimic the flashes of females of other species to draw in males. They also have this hawking behavior where they'll fly above other firefly individuals and attack them from above when they flash. And they've also been observed stealing fireflies that are stuck in spider webs. So this is a really interesting behavior. And essentially it's all about defense. So these females are feeding on other fireflies so they can acquire these defensive compounds. Lucibufagins is what they're called. And essentially, they're not able to produce these by themselves. So they eat fireflies, they get these defensive compounds, and then they pass those on to the egg and then to their larvae to deter predators. So really, really cool, really interesting behavior within this group of fireflies. So there are a variety of different firefly species that we can find in the eastern United States and in Canada. This here is a figure just showing some of the most common genera here. So here, Photinus pyralis. This is the common eastern firefly that we see quite often. And you can see here that we have species that flash represented. We have glowworm species represented, and we also have our dark or day active species represented. So you can find all of these around here in Ohio. We have a great diversity of fireflies within our region. So fireflies only are in the adult stage for about 3 to 4 weeks. And the majority of their life is actually spent as a larvae in the soil or in the water. And they can be a larvae for 1 to 2 years, which for an insect, that is a really long time. And so knowing a little bit about firefly life cycle and the life stages can really help us implement some conservation management strategies and help support fireflies within our landscapes. And so this here is just a little diagram depicting the life cycle of our different groups, the glowworms, our flashing species, and our dark species. And so eggs are laid in the soil. And then when those eggs hatch, we have the larvae that can remain in the soil. So this is an example of a terrestrial species here, but we also have semi-aquatic and aquatic larvae. But the larvae in this example will remain in the soil for 1 to 2 years. They can pupate in the soil as well, so they can pupate in sort of pupation chambers where there are multiple pupae within one area. They can be at the soil surface, or they can be further underground. And they remain as a pupae for about 3 weeks, and then they emerge as an adult, where again, their main job is locating mates and reproducing. And so fireflies, firefly larvae are voracious predators. That is their job, is they hunt down prey, they eat, they grow, and a lot of the nutrients that they get as a larvae are carried over into the adult. And so the adults rely on sort of the efficiency of the larvae at catching and eating prey. And so they are predators of snails, slugs, earthworms. There's some species that specialize on snails and slugs, other species that specialize on earthworms, but they'll also eat other soft-bodied invertebrates. The mandibles of the larvae are actually channeled. And so when they find a piece of prey and they pierce it, they actually inject venom into that prey. And there's not a lot of research that has been done on this venom, but it's thought to be a neurotoxin that essentially paralyzes the prey. But we really don't know anything about the compound or how it's produced. There's a lot more work to be done in that regard. But once they've got their prey, they essentially release digestive enzymes and they dissolve the prey and then ingest the prey liquid. They've got this really interesting retractable head, as you can see here in this figure. And so that's essentially so that they can stick their head up into the shells, of snails. And so oftentimes we see snail specialists have this long retractable head so that they can stick it up in there and start munching. They also have interesting behaviors where they'll jump on the shell of the snail and bite down from above. They're just really intense, these larvae. As I mentioned, so they can be terrestrial, they can be semi-aquatic, or they can be aquatic. And so they can be found on the soil surface, in leaf litter, and rotting logs, but you can also find them on the banks of rivers and on the banks of ponds, or actually in the rivers and in the ponds. So they can be very diverse. But generally speaking, they require moist habitats. And so this is because they're very prone to desiccation, but also their prey are also very prone to desiccation. Snails, slugs, earthworms are their main prey. They're very susceptible to drying out. And so moist habitats are best for firefly larvae and their prey. And they're also thought to be nocturnal. Although we really don't know enough about the larval stages of fireflies. And in fact, there are some firefly species where we don't know anything. The larvae are entirely unknown, and we only know about the adults. And so, as I mentioned, larvae can be found in a variety of different environments, and this then relates to their body shape and their body form. And so you can have species that are really round, that have short legs, that have very soft membranous tissue that are found primarily in the soil. You can also have species that are found in the leaf litter, and these tend to be really flat with sort of these projections along the body, as you can see in this figure here, E. We have species that primarily forage in trees, and so these species tend to be really flat. They tend to have long legs, and they also have these hardened plates on their body. So, they have their exoskeleton, and usually those species that climb trees have really hard exoskeletons on the top and on the bottom. And then, of course, we have our species that are more aquatic, and they tend to have reduced hardened plates on their body and have more membranous tissue. And so these larvae have really evolved to live within these different environments and to be able to succeed in these habitats. Another really interesting fact about the larvae is that they're all bioluminescent. So every firefly larvae can produce light. Even those species, the dark species where the adults don't produce light, the larvae do, and they've actually lost that ability as an adult. And so this is thought, light production in larvae is thought to primarily function as defensive strategy. So a warning signal to predators. Because remember, larvae aren't looking for mates. They're looking for prey, and they're looking for food. Like they just want to eat and grow. And so we have species that sort of have 2 dots at the tail here. We have some species that have 4 spots of light, and others that can actually have light all through the abdomen. But all larvae of firefly species that are currently described can produce light. So although fireflies have a variety of different defenses against predators, so they have the light warning signal, they have those defensive chemicals that I talked about, there are a suite of insectivorous predators that will feed on fireflies, primarily other arthropods. So we have evidence of daddy longlegs feeding on fireflies, different bug species. This bug, its piercing mouth part is stuck. I don't know if you can see it, but it's stuck into the firefly. It's sucking out the firefly's juices. We have spiders. Fireflies commonly get stuck in spider webs, and spiders feed on them. There is some evidence that adult fireflies are toxic to vertebrates, but we often find that birds feed on firefly larvae. And we also see a variety of parasites that impact fireflies, like nematodes. We have some fungal species as well. And so there are a suite of other critters that are feeding on fireflies, even though they have these strong defensive strategies. Okay, so I've given you a brief background on firefly biology. I pointed out a lot of areas that we really don't know about fireflies. There are a lot of their biology and ecology that is yet to be discovered. But the question here that I'm posing, tying back to our conversation about insect decline, are fireflies declining? Is this a group? We've heard a lot about anecdotally fireflies declining. Like, is this the case? And the short answer to this question is maybe. Really, we don't have enough data to say whether fireflies are declining. Most of the reports that we have are anecdotal from experts and from all of you, right? When we were younger, there seemed to be more fireflies than there are now. That is a very common observation and statement. However, the monitoring data to support those observations just isn't there. I am going to share one study where they did look at some long-term data of fireflies. And so this project is associated with the Kellogg Biological Station Long-Term Ecological Research Site. It's a National Science Foundation funded research site, and it's in Michigan. And they have this agroecosystem management experiment, and that's what's shown in this picture here. And they have like 10 different plant community treatments that they're sampling for all different factors. And one of them is insects. And they're using these yellow sticky cards here. They put out into the fields to sample insects. One of the other groups that they look at are lady beetles, but they're also counting fireflies. And so they have firefly data from 2004 to 2015. And so here they analyze the data from that 12-year span, and this is what they have. So this is looking at adult fireflies per yellow sticky card trap from 2004 to 2015. And here you can see all the colored dots are all those different plant treatments that they're sampling in. And they found this really interesting result, and that fireflies go through a natural population cycle where some years they're really abundant naturally, and other years they're less abundant naturally. And so with 12 years of data, they were able to depict this cycle, but that suggests that 12 years of data is actually not enough to detect population declines in fireflies. We need to be able to observe these cycles, but then also observe the trend of those cycles over time, see whether they're declining or whether they're increasing. 12 years of data, that's a lot of data, but it's not enough, believe it or not. And so there's also a really, another really interesting conclusion from this study that I wanted to share with you, really sort of honing in on the value of long-term data. And so this is essentially just another version of that figure that I showed you, but just sort of combining all of those plant treatments together. It's a bit cleaner to look at. You can see sort of this population cycle of fireflies over time. And you can see over these 12 years, generally stable. We don't see a trend going up or down outside of these cyclical patterns. But what happens if we didn't sample for 12 years? Let's say we sampled for like a typical graduate student program, which would be like 3 to 4 years. And what happens if we sampled from 2005 to 2008? Well, our conclusion would be very different if we had only 4 years of data and if we had 12 years of data. If we looked at data from 2005 to 2008, we'd be like, oh my gosh, fireflies, they're declining rapidly. We need to do something right now. But really, we're just catching this downward trend in their natural population cycle. But if we would have sampled from 2008 to 2012, we would say, wow, fireflies are increasing. They must be doing great. No need to worry about them. And so really what this is saying is that this understanding whether insects are declining or not is a very complicated question. And we need a lot of resources in order to be confident in our conclusions that we're having. And so I want you to keep this in mind as you're seeing insect decline articles come into the popular media, and you're hearing news reports. Think about what that study is showing, how they collected their data and how much data they have, and think really critically about those conclusions that you're being provided. Okay, so there's not enough data. So then what do? Well, let's poll the experts. Let's poll the folks that specialize on fireflies and see what they think. Well, the International Union for Conservation of Nature polled firefly specialists, and they reviewed for North America 132 of the species found within North America, and they categorized them. And so they, based on their expert opinion, consider 18 species, which is about 14%, to be threatened within North America. And these are mostly habitat specialists. So these are species that are generally restricted in their habitat, that coastal ecosystems, swamps, bogs, very restricted. And in fact, we have one, the pointy-lobed firefly, that is found in Ohio, and it specializes in bogs and marshes. But what is maybe even more troubling, coming from the experts, is that there's more than 3% of species where we are data deficient. We don't know enough about those species to say whether they're threatened or not. And so I really think that this is a very conservative estimate of threatened species within North America. We just don't have enough information. We also polled those experts about what they think might be threatening fireflies. And so we had experts from all across the globe respond to this, and they converged on a few different human activities that might be impacting fireflies. So habitat loss, light pollution, pesticide use, and water pollution. And so I want to dive into these top three really briefly before we get into what you can do to help fireflies. And so first, habitat loss and fragmentation. And so this essentially is disrupting habitat for the larvae as well as for the adults. And there are certain species that have particular behaviors or ecologies that are going to be more susceptible to habitat loss and fragmentation. And so particularly those glowworm species that have flightless females, they're not able to disperse away from these areas, and they often get trampled or killed. We also have very specific habitat or diet specialists. So those that live along coasts are going to be impacted, for example, by suburban development along the coast. We also have species that are just generally regionally restricted. And so they have small populations that are dispersed around rather than really generalist common species. And those are just naturally more susceptible to habitat loss. We also have light pollution, so sources of artificial light at night is what we call them, or a LAN. And so these come from a variety of different sources. So around major urban centers, we have diffuse sky glow that can actually reach way outside the city. We have lights associated with roadways and our cars. We have industry and advertising lights. We have agricultural light pollution. And then of course we have light pollution within our neighborhoods and around our own houses. And so collectively, this light pollution impacts this bioluminescent communication that is required for species to reproduce. And so light pollution can have both behavioral and physiological impacts on fireflies. And the most important one is this disruption of communication. It really impacts the ability of males to locate females and successfully reproduce. So therefore, you're losing populations if they're not able to reproduce within these areas. So within North America, we have 75% of the firefly species that are active at night or active at dusk that use this bioluminescent courtship strategies. So all of these species could be susceptible to our increasing light pollution that we see. And so there is some work that has looked at, well, what types of lights might we want to use outside to not impact fireflies and their bioluminescent communication. And so this study here looked at, this is the rate of males flashing in the dark in gray. And then we've got a variety of different colored lights here: cool white, warm white, blue, amber, and red. And essentially the conclusion that they came to was that male flash rate was reduced under all light types. There isn't one that's really better for fireflies. And this is because a lot of these different light colors overlap with the spectral sensitivity of male fireflies. And so here in white are the spectral sensitivities of the males. And then here in the colors, you can see where all of those different colored lights fall into place. So we've got cool white and warm white, which have sort of a low intensity, but they encompass a lot of different wavelengths. And then we have blue, amber, and red in these peaks. And we can actually look at female response as well. And so in this same experiment, they looked at the percentage rate of female responses. So after they see that male flash, how likely is a female going to respond back under these different treatments? So again, we've got dark and we've got all our different colors of light. And so essentially, females did great at responding when they were in the dark, but not so well under all of these other lighting treatments, although red did better than the other colors. And so what does this mean? We can really think about how the species biology is going to determine the extent of these impacts. And so likely we're not going to see those day active species that use chemical communication. They're not going to be impacted by light pollution, but all of these species that are flashing at night will be. And their essential general conclusion is that there's no light that's really universally friendly to fireflies, but if you had to pick, red is sort of the preferable color. And here I just wanted to show a quick map of light pollution, very widespread in the eastern United States, very widespread in Europe, has the potential to be a really important stressor for fireflies. And then really briefly, I just wanted to talk about pesticide use. This is a major stressor, particularly for larvae, because they're spending a lot of their life cycle in the soil, along rivers or in terrestrial habitats. And so there is some evidence that pesticide use can affect behaviors in larvae. And so they forage and feed less, or they spend less time in their protective chambers, which can have down the road effects on growth and survival. And it could also potentially impact those flightless females that are primarily living in the soil. And then of course, it can also indirectly impact prey populations, which the larvae need to grow and develop. Okay, so lastly, I wanted to finish up this talk with some suggestions about how you can help protect fireflies, sort of feeding into the biology and ecology that we've talked about. How can we put that into action in our own homes and yards? And so the big one is to really protect, enhance, and create habitat for fireflies. And so, of course, this means really avoid pesticide use in your yard. Can impact the larvae, it can impact the prey, and is generally not great for insects overall. You can also promote natural areas within your yard that provide a variety of different habitat for adults and for larvae. So areas of unmown vegetation, keeping leaf litter around where it's appropriate, either in flower beds or in your garden. Also keeping areas of natural downed wood that the larvae use for overwintering and for feeding. Another thing that you can do to improve habitat quality in your yard is to create vertical habitat complexity, is what I'm calling it, with native plants. So essentially, plant native grasses, native shrubs, native trees of varying heights to create this central vertical structure and vertical complexity within your yard. And so this provides a couple of different things. So it enhances moisture retention at the soil surface, which is great for larvae because they're prone to desiccation. It's also great for their prey species, earthworms, slugs, snails. So you can support the larvae, but then you also have the vertical structure that the adults will use when they are doing courtship displays. You could also maintain moisture by adding a water feature, and the larvae are also prone to trampling. And so if you have paths within your yard, you want to try and use those and not trample through the habitat that you've just created. Also think about eliminating unnecessary lighting around your house and around your yard. So think about using motion detectors or timers. If you can, using red bulbs or red light filters. And also just closing the curtains at night to keep that light from spilling out into your yard. And so I have some pictures here. Think about using sort of shields on lights. We've got this best case scenario where the light is only lighting the intended area compared to more diffuse light that is creating a lot of light pollution. And sort of here's an example of that sort of surrounding your house. Only light the areas in which you intend to light with that outdoor lighting. And then lastly, to help with this lack of data that I keep talking about and the issues of looking at long-term population trends of fireflies, consider signing up for this community science program, Firefly Watch. So you can Google Firefly Watch, go to their website. There's an option to participate. They'll give you some resources like this one I have here. You can get information about the different flight patterns, the flash patterns of different common species. So you can know what species you have just by the flashing pattern. They give you data sheets and there's specific questions that they want you to do. I think it's it might be weekly for the time when the adults are active. But essentially, you can collect this data in your yard or in a nearby park and submit it to this program, which is then used across Eastern North America. Actually, I think this is all of North America. Yeah, anyone in North America can participate in this program. And so essentially, this is a program that's gathering data across a really broad geographical region and collecting it every year. And it's going to be really valuable for assessing firefly species and firefly decline. So I was playing around on the website, and so you can actually go on and look at last year's data, and they have it set for each week. And so I picked May 30th. And so here, each of these spots is someone that was detecting fireflies in a particular location. And you can see that during this particular week, there was a lot of firefly sightings in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. There's also a lot of fireflies in Atlanta. This is a really great program, and I would highly encourage you to participate. And the last thing I wanted to share with you is if you want to learn more about fireflies, glowworms, lightning bugs, I highly recommend this book. I have a copy of it up here in case you want to take a look, but it's got this really, really cool diagram at the front that shows the flash patterns of really common species within Eastern North America. It also shows that the different colors of lights that the species produce. Really great resource. It's got a little bit of information on the biology and ecology of fireflies, but most of this is just individual species accounts. So you can go in and you can read about species, how to identify them, what they need, what they look like. This is a really great resource. It's like 20 to 30 bucks on Amazon. Highly recommend it. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for your attention today. I really enjoyed giving this presentation. I'm really happy that all of you could come out this evening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
You recommend particular native plants?
For fireflies, no. Native plants always, because that helps all insect biodiversity, but they're not necessarily feeding on those plants. It's more about staying native, but being diverse, both species-wise, but also, structurally, for fireflies. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Sure.
The first one is about fireflies, and the second one's about lady beetles.
Okay.
So for fireflies, for the larva, when you find adult fireflies in your yard, I guess I'm wondering how far do fireflies fly? Like if larvae is in your yard, will they be the same when they're adults? Or do they stay in your yard?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, possibly. And so it depends on what habitat is available. So if the adults, if those larvae emerge as adults and the environment is right for them, they're able to find mates, then yes, they might stay. But that is the stage that is more capable of dispersal. And so if they need to leave, that's the time in which they're going to find the habitat and resources that they need. And so it is very possible, yes, that you will have larvae within that same habitat, but not necessarily.
Thank you. My other question is about lady beetles. We did a mosquito pilot program here in Bexley with Dr. Mary Gardner and Dr. Megan Muty. And they found during their study that the number of lady beetles in Bexley was substantially lower than anywhere else that they've studied over a 17-year period. And I wondered if you had any insight as to why our lady beetle numbers would be lower.
That's a very, that's interesting. Well, lady beetles require prey. And so they might also have looked at the prey populations to see if there's a relation there. They're also really influenced by landscape as well. And so the amount of urbanization that are surrounding their sites could then impact the lady beetle species that are present within the city. Mary's also worked in Cleveland, which has more green space. There's a lot of vacant land in Cleveland compared to Columbus. And so there could be a relationship there in terms of just the amount of habitat within a growing city like Columbus compared to a legacy or shrinking city like Cleveland. You know, for lady beetles, it could also be overwintering habitat. And so that's sort of more of a question for lady beetle biology and ecology, is sort of where do they overwinter and what sort of resources do they need? We know less about that. There is some evidence that they can overwinter in forests or at the base of trees and leaf litter. And so thinking about like the amount of urban forests that might be around here to support them to stay in the city. There are a lot of different potential reasons why that could be, but that's a very interesting pattern. I assume Mary will follow up with that, being the lady beetle expert that she is. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I've really appreciated this. I was wondering, in terms of the adults live 3 to 4 weeks, what is the season for seeing them emerge?
It's very close to now. So it would be May, June, July. So this
it'll be continuous through that time. There'll be different ones coming out.
Yep.
Okay. And the other quick question is, I understand about pesticides. Does fertilizing your garden affect the larva?
Not that I'm aware of. But then again, we don't know very much about larvae and sort of impacts of stressors on larvae in particular. But I'm not aware of any studies that have looked at that specifically.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perry. It was a wonderful talk. Thanks for coming out tonight.